You know what made me finally lose my patience? I was refinishing a cherry end table, a nice piece, solid wood, beautiful grain. But it had 3 or 4 dents across the top. Not deep gouges, just the kind of dings you get from years of setting coffee mugs down a little too hard. So I did what I always do. I grabbed my sanding block and started working through the grits. And I sanded right through the stain and into bare wood before those dents were even halfway gone. I was removing perfectly good material trying to fix damage that went maybe a 32nd of an inch deep. It was the most frustrating afternoon I'd had in the shop in a long time. Then about a year later, I was watching an old furniture restorer work on an antique dresser, and he pulled out a clothes iron and a wet rag. No sandpaper in sight. 10 minutes later, those dents were gone. Completely gone. And he hadn't removed a single fiber of wood from that surface. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how that works, why it works, and how you can start using it on your own projects. Plus, stick around to the end because I'll show you a trick for getting into tight spots that most people have never even considered. Let's get into it. What we're talking about today is one of the simplest and most effective repair techniques in all of woodworking. And somehow it's one of the least known among home shop woodworkers. Once you understand the principle behind it, you'll wonder why you ever reached for sandpaper to fix a dent in the first place. So let me start by telling you where this method comes from and why it stood the test of time. The restorer I watched that day was a third-generation cabinet maker. His grandfather had trained in Germany under the old guild system, what they call the Handwerkskammer, the skilled trades guild structure that goes back to the medieval period. In that system, you didn't just learn how to build furniture, you spent years as an apprentice learning how to repair it, how to maintain it, how to bring damaged pieces back to life without leaving any trace of your work. And this wasn't considered a lesser skill. In the European guild tradition, a master cabinet maker was expected to make a repair invisible. If a client could tell where the fix was, you hadn't done your job. These guilds operated across Germany, France, England, and most of Central Europe from the 1300s, all the way through the Industrial Revolution. The French called their master furniture makers ébénistes, and the Germans called them Schreinermeister. And in every one of these traditions, steam repair was considered fundamental knowledge. It was one of the first things an apprentice learned because it taught you something critical about the material you were working with. Wood is not dead. It responds to moisture, to heat, to pressure. And if you understand how it responds, you can manipulate it in ways that feel almost like magic. But it's not magic, it's material science, and it's been tested over centuries of daily use by people who staked their entire livelihood on getting it right. The reason this method has faded from common knowledge is simple. Power sanders got cheap and fast, and most people stopped thinking about what was actually happening inside the wood when it got damaged. But the old guild restorers never stopped thinking about it. And what they understood is what I want to share with you now. Let's start with the science, because once you understand why this works, everything else falls into place. When a piece of wood gets dented, say someone drops a hammer on a tabletop or a chair leg gets kicked, the fibers at the surface aren't cut or removed. They're crushed. Think of it like a bundle of drinking straws. If you press down on them, they flatten out, but they're still there. They haven't gone anywhere, they're just compressed into a smaller space. Wood cells work the same way. They're made of cellulose, which is a natural polymer that has a remarkable property. It absorbs water. And when cellulose absorbs water, it swells. So if you can introduce moisture into those crushed fibers and then add heat to accelerate the absorption and turn that water to steam, those fibers will swell back toward their original shape. You're not adding material. You're not filling anything. You're letting the wood remember what it used to look like. I know that sounds poetic, but it's literally what's happening at a cellular level. The crushed cell walls absorb the steam, expand, and push back up to the original surface plane. When I first tried this on a piece of hard maple that had a dent from a dropped clamp, I watched the surface rise up over about 30 seconds. It was one of those moments where you just stand there thinking, why didn't anyone tell me about this 20 years ago? The key thing to understand is that this process works because the fibers are intact. They're damaged, but they're not severed. And that distinction is everything. Which brings us to the next point. Not every mark on a piece of wood is a candidate for steam repair, and knowing the difference will save you a lot of frustration. A dent is compressed fibers, a scratch is displaced fibers, and a gouge is severed fibers. If you run your fingernail across the damage and you can feel a sharp edge or a groove where material has clearly been cut away, steam alone won't fix that. The fibers aren't there anymore to swell back. But if the damage feels like a shallow depression, smooth at the bottom with no torn or missing wood, that's a dent. And steam will almost certainly bring it back. Scratches fall somewhere in between. A light surface scratch where the fibers are bent but not broken will often respond beautifully to steam. A deep scratch where a nail or a screw actually carved a channel through the grain. That one's going to need a different approach. Here's a quick test I use. Wet the damaged area with just a drop of water on your fingertip. If the dent or scratch starts to become less visible within a few seconds as the water soaks in, That's the fibers already beginning to swell. That tells you steam will finish the job. If the water sits in the depression and nothing changes, you're probably looking at severed fibers and you'll need to consider filling or patching instead. The species of wood matters too. Open-grained woods like white oak, red oak, ash, and walnut respond incredibly well to steam. The open pore structure lets moisture penetrate quickly. Tight-grained woods like hard maple and cherry also work. They just take a little more patience and sometimes a second or third application. The one area where you need real caution is veneer. If you're working on a veneered surface, the steam can soften the glue underneath, especially on older pieces that used hide glue. It still works, but you need a lighter touch, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old-world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Lost Workshop, and it is a complete guide to hand tool woodworking the way medieval craftsmen actually did it. 156 pages, 17 chapters, 33 illustrations. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. Alright, let us keep going. Now let me walk you through the actual technique step by step, because the details matter more than you might think. You need 3 things: a standard clothes iron, the kind you'd use on a dress shirt, a clean cotton cloth, something like an old tea towel or a piece of plain white cotton fabric, and a small container of clean water. That's it. No special tools, no expensive products. First, set your iron to medium-high heat. You want it hot enough to generate steam, but not so hot that it scorches wood. If your iron has a steam setting, turn it off. You're going to create the steam yourself with the wet cloth, and you want to control exactly how much moisture hits the wood. Take your cloth and get it damp. Not dripping wet, just damp enough that if you pressed it against a dry surface, you'd see a faint moisture mark. Fold it over once or twice so you have a couple of layers between the iron and the wood. Now lay the damp cloth directly over the dent. Place the iron on top of the cloth, right over the damaged area. Hold it there for about 10 seconds. You'll hear a gentle hissing sound as the water in the cloth turns to steam and gets driven down into the wood fibers. After 10 seconds, lift the iron and the cloth and check your progress. In most cases, on a fresh dent in something like white oak, you'll see the surface has already started to rise. If it's not fully level yet, re-dampen the cloth, put it back, and give it another 10 seconds. Most dents in. Softwoods like pine or cedar come up in 1 or 2 passes. Hardwoods like maple or cherry might need 3 or 4. I worked on a walnut table once that had a dent from a cast iron skillet. A good deep one, maybe a 1/16 of an inch. And it took 5 passes over about 15 minutes, but it came up completely flush. The surface was perfect. Here's what to watch for. If you see the wood starting to darken beyond the dent area, you're using too much heat or too much moisture. And never press down hard with the iron. The weight of the iron itself is enough. You're not trying to flatten the cloth into the wood. You're just trying to get steam into those compressed fibers. Now, once you've got the basic technique down, let me tell you how the old guild restorers handled trickier situations. The surface of the dent with a fine needle or an awl, just tiny holes, barely visible, straight down into the compressed fibers. What this does is give the steam a pathway into the deeper layers of the wood. Without those pinpricks, the steam might only reach the top layer of crushed cells and you'd get partial recovery. With them, the moisture penetrates all the way through the damage, and you get a much more complete result. On a piece of old-growth white oak I was repairing last year, I used this needle technique on a dent that was easily 3/32 of an inch deep. 3 passes with the iron after pricking, and it came up perfectly. Without the needle prep, I'd been getting maybe 60% recovery. On older furniture, especially pieces with existing finishes, the approach changes slightly. If the piece has an old shellac or lacquer finish, the steam will sometimes cloud or blister the finish in the immediate area. The guild method for handling this was to work in very short bursts, 5 seconds instead of 10, and to use a barely damp cloth rather than a fully damp one. You sacrifice speed for control. The dent still comes up, it just takes more passes. And if you're working on a piece with a varnish or polyurethane finish, you'll often find that the finish itself is flexible enough to move with the wood as the fibers swell back. Protecting the surrounding area is something the old restorers took very seriously, and it's where most of us get sloppy. The mistake I used to make was laying the wet cloth across a bigger area than necessary. Steam doesn't just go straight down, it spreads. And if you're putting steam into an area that doesn't need it, you can raise the grain across the whole surface, which then requires sanding to smooth out, which defeats the entire purpose. The guild approach is to use the smallest cloth area possible. Fold your cotton cloth down to just slightly larger than the dent itself. Some restorers I've spoken with cut small squares of cotton, specifically for this, about 2 inches by 2 inches, and keep a stack of them in in their repair kit. For work near edges or joints, they would sometimes mask off the surrounding area with a thin sheet of brass or aluminum, something that would block the steam from reaching areas that didn't need it. I use a piece of aluminum flashing from the hardware store, costs almost nothing, and I cut it to whatever shape I need. It's a small detail, but it's the difference between a repair that's invisible and one that creates a new problem. Let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for sandpaper as the default fix for any surface damage. Most of us do this because sanding is what we know. It's the first solution we learned, and it works for so many things that we apply it to everything. But when you sand out a dent, you're removing the wood around the dent to bring the surface down to the level of the damage. You're making the whole piece thinner to match the lowest point. The guild approach is the opposite. Bring the low point back up to the existing surface. No material lost. The second pattern is using wood filler on dents. I did this for years. If sanding didn't work, I'd mix up some filler, press it into the depression, sand it smooth, and it never looked right. Because filler doesn't have grain, it doesn't absorb stain the same way. It always shows. The steam method leaves you with actual wood at the surface with its original grain and color intact. The third pattern is applying too much pressure with clamps and work holding during a build and then just accepting the dents as inevitable. Once I learned the steam technique, I stopped worrying about clamp marks entirely. I just fix them after the glue dries. It takes 2 minutes. That one change alone made my finishing process dramatically less stressful. The fourth pattern is rushing the repair. Modern instinct says fix it now, move on. The guild tradition says take your time, do multiple light passes, check your work between each one. Every time I've rushed this technique and used too much water or too much heat, I've ended up with a bigger problem than I started with. Patience isn't optional here. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you start choosing the right tool for each situation instead of defaulting to the same approach every time. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is one I picked up from a restorer who specialized in carved and turned pieces. Things like chair legs, finials, and decorative moldings, where you can't lay a flat iron across the surface. His solution was a soldering iron with a fine conical tip, not a wood burner, a standard electronics soldering iron set to about 500 degrees Fahrenheit. He would wrap the tip with a tiny piece of damp cotton, just a small square held in place with a twist of wire, and then press that directly into the dent inside a carving, or along the curve of a turning. The precision was incredible. He could target an area smaller than a pencil eraser. I tried this on a cherry spindle that had a dent right in the transition between a bead and a cove, a spot I could never have reached with a clothes iron. 3 applications with the wrapped soldering iron tip, about 5 seconds each, and the dent was gone. The surrounding detail was completely untouched. If you do any restoration work on carved or turned pieces, this one technique will save you hours of frustration. Just make sure your cotton wrap is damp enough to produce steam and small enough to stay on the tip. And keep a little dish of water nearby to re-wet it between passes. Before we wrap up, if today's video taught you something new, imagine having 100 techniques like this at your fingertips. That is exactly what the Lost Workshop is. It is my complete guide to medieval hand tool woodworking, all in one place with 17 chapters, 33 illustrations, and 156 pages of clear instructions. You can get your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or using the link in the description. Thanks for being here. Subscribe if you have not yet, and I will see you next time.